There is a smell that reaches you before the shoreline does. Sailors have written about it for centuries, a sweetness carried on warm air, drifting out over the Mozambique Channel long before any coastline appears on the horizon. Vanilla, clove, and underneath it, something headier, ylang ylang, the flower distilled into some of the world's most expensive perfumes. They call these the Perfume Islands. But spend a little time here, and you start to notice a second thing carried on that same warm air, a kind of tension, quiet but constant, between extraordinary beauty and extraordinary instability, between a home that people love fiercely and a homeland that has struggled again and again to simply hold itself together. This is Comoros. 4 small volcanic islands scattered at the mouth of the Mozambique Channel, between Madagascar and the East African coast. 3 of them form an independent nation. The 4th remains French. And in the 50 years since independence, this tiny archipelago has lived through so many coups and attempted coups that journalists once nicknamed it, only half-jokingly, the Coups Islands. We're going to walk through what daily life actually looks like on these islands, the mountains, the markets, the meals, the weddings that can define a person's entire social standing, and we're going to be honest about the harder chapters too. Because that honesty is the only way to really understand a place like this. Before we go further, if you enjoy this kind of grounded, unhurried look at how people actually live around the world, consider subscribing. It helps this channel keep making them. And I'm curious, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching this from tonight. Start with the land itself, because on Comoros the land is impossible to ignore. The country is young. Geologically speaking, every one of its islands was built by volcanoes, and one of them is still very much alive. Grande Comore, the largest island and home to the capital, is dominated by Mount Carthala, an active volcano that rises well over 2,000 meters and holds one of the largest volcanic craters on Earth. Its rim wide enough that clouds sometimes pool inside it like water in a bowl. Carthala has erupted repeatedly in living memory, most notably sending thousands fleeing in 2005 when it began spewing ash and gas. People here don't talk about the volcano the way you might expect, with dread. They talk about it the way you'd talk about a moody relative, respected, occasionally alarming, permanently part of the family. Because Grand Comore's lava rock is so young and porous, rain vanishes straight through it. There are almost no rivers here. Villages have relied for generations on stone cisterns and catchment tanks to store what falls from the sky. A quiet, practical adaptation to living on a rock that can't hold its own water. Anjouan, the second island, tells a different geological story, older. Its soil deeper and richer, its coastline framed by a real coral reef and a proper harbor at Mutsamudu. From above, Anjouan looks almost engineered, its coastline pulled into a near-perfect triangle by 3 volcanic mountain ranges that meet at a shared peak. Then there's Moli, the smallest and quietest of the 3, a low plateau cloaked in dense forest. With some of the most pristine marine waters in the entire archipelago, waters that shelter sea turtles and, seasonally, humpback whales passing through the channel. The capital itself sits right at the foot of that volcano. Moroni, on the western coast of Grande Comore, is a compact, sun-bleached port city built around a working harbor. Its old quarter a tangle of narrow coral stone lanes, carved wooden doors, and a historic mosque whose minaret has watched over the waterfront for generations. It's not a large city by global standards, but it functions as the country's political, commercial, and religious center all at once, the place where government ministries, the main hospital, the central market, and the busiest mosque in the country all sit within walking distance of each other. Step outside Moroni, though, and the country changes quickly. Most Comorians still live in smaller towns and farming villages, spread along the coast or tucked into the green folds of the volcanic slopes, where the rhythm of the day still runs closer to the tide and the harvest than to any office clock. The climate binds all three islands together in a shared rhythm. There are really only two seasons here. A hot, humid stretch from roughly November through April, when moisture rolls in from the northwest, rain falls in heavy tropical bursts, and cyclones occasionally threaten the coast. And a cooler, drier season for the rest of the year, when temperatures ease and the islands are at their most pleasant, rarely climbing much past 30 degrees Celsius. Locals call these seasons Kashkasi and Kusi, and everything planting, harvesting, wedding season, even fishing patterns moves around that same seasonal clock. There is no snow here, no true winter, nothing close to the four seasons much of the world takes for granted. Just the wet months and the dry months, endlessly repeating. The volcano watching over all of it. What's striking when you actually walk these islands is how small the distances are and how large they feel. Grande, Comoros, Moli, and Anjouan sit only tens of kilometers apart, yet the lack of good harbors and reliable inter-island transport has historically made travel between them slower and more complicated than the map suggests. A trip that looks like a short hop on satellite imagery can mean hours on a boat across genuinely rough channel water. That isolation, islands close enough to see each other on a clear day, yet separated by water that doesn't always cooperate, has shaped everything from politics to family life here for a very long time. Now picture an actual morning on these islands, because that's where the country starts to feel less like statistics and more like something you could step into. In a hillside village outside Moroni, the capital, the day usually begins early, before the heat sets in. Homes here range widely. In the cities, you'll find modern concrete houses with tiled floors and satellite dishes bolted to the roof, while in more rural areas, especially on Anjouan and Moli, homes are often simpler structures of stone, coral rag, or cinder block, roofed in corrugated metal, clustered tightly along narrow lanes that wind uphill. Extended family tends to live close together, sometimes under the same roof, sometimes in adjoining houses built around a shared courtyard, a practical response to both tradition and economics, but also a genuine cultural preference. Family here is not a weekend obligation. It's the daily operating structure of life. Food anchors the day the way it does across much of the Indian Ocean world. Breakfast might be simple bread, sweet tea, maybe fruit. But it's really lunch and dinner where Comorian cooking shows what it is. A genuine fusion built from African, Arab, Persian, and French influences layered on top of each other over centuries of trade. Rice is the staple, almost always present, alongside cassava, plantain, and breadfruit. Coconut milk turns up constantly, softening sauces and stews. And then there are the spices that gave these islands their nickname in the first place: vanilla, clove, cinnamon, cardamom. Nutmeg grown right there on the volcanic slopes and worked directly into the cooking, not just exported in sacks to European perfumeries. The dish most associated with the country, langouste de la vanille, sounds almost improbable until you understand the islands that produced it: fresh, spiny lobster, pulled from Comorian waters, finished in a delicate sauce built around local vanilla, butter, and white wine. It is, in a very literal sense, the sea and the soil of these islands served on the same plate. Alongside it, you'll find makatra fautra, a savory bread made with coconut water, cooked fresh and torn by hand; palau, a fragrant spiced rice dish showing clear Arab and East African roots, often reserved for special occasions, and mshikiki, marinated beef skewers grilled over open flame, a close cousin to dishes found across the Swahili coast in Kenya and Tanzania. Meals are traditionally shared from a central platter, eaten with the right hand, a custom rooted in both Islamic practice and a broader culture where eating is rarely a solitary act. Someone is almost always sitting across from you. Getting around the country is its own daily negotiation. Within a town or village, walking is still the default, and shared taxis, small cars packed well beyond what you'd expect, running along fixed routes for a fixed fare handle most longer trips on the ground. Roads exist across all three islands, but a large share of the network is unpaved or in poor repair, which turns even a modest distance into a slow, bouncing journey. Especially once the rainy season softens the dirt tracks in the more rural stretches of Anjouan and Moli. Moving between islands, meanwhile, still generally means a boat, since there is no bridge and no tunnel to speak of, only small ferries and motorized vessels crossing channel water that can turn rough with very little warning. And yet, for all that, mobile phones are everywhere. Signal reaches even fairly remote villages now, and phones have become the practical backbone of daily coordination here, arranging a boat crossing, checking in with a son or daughter working in France, transferring a little money home. In a place where formal infrastructure has often struggled to keep up with people's needs, the mobile phone has quietly become one of the few systems that actually works, island to island and continent to continent. The heart of the everyday economy is the market. In Moroni's old town and in smaller versions in Mutsamudu and Fomboni, market days bring vendors together under corrugated awnings and open sky alike, women selling bundles of cassava leaves, spinach, and green bananas. Fishmongers laying out the morning's catch, still glistening, on wooden tables, sacks of imported rice stacked beside baskets of homegrown chilies, tamarind, and breadfruit. Haggling is expected, conversation is constant, and the market functions as much as a social space as a commercial one, a place to hear news, settle small disputes, and catch up with neighbors from the next village over. It's a very physical, unhurried kind of commerce, one built on relationships that often stretch back generations between the same families of buyers and sellers. Language moves through daily life in layers, switching depending on who you're speaking to and where you are. Nearly the entire population speaks Shikamori, sometimes called Comorian, a Bantu language closely related to Swahili, with distinct dialects on each island. Shingazija on Grande Comore, Shinzwani on Anjouan, Shimwali on Moli. This is the language of the home, the market, the street, the language a grandmother uses with her grandchildren. French sits alongside it as the language of school, government offices, and formal business, a legacy of the colonial period that never fully displaced Shikamori the way it did in some other former colonies. And Arabic threads through religious life the language of the mosque, of Quranic schooling, of the Islamic education that runs parallel to the standard school system for most Comorian children. A single conversation here can genuinely drift between all three languages within a few sentences, and nobody blinks. Which brings us to the one idea that, more than any other, explains how Comorian society actually works, because underneath the geography and the food and the languages, there is a single cultural institution that shapes status, ambition, and family life on these islands more than almost anything else. Locals call it the Anda. Outsiders usually translate it as the grand marriage, the grand marriage. And to call it simply a wedding badly undersells what it actually is. A Comorian man can marry through a modest, ordinary Islamic ceremony at almost any point in his life. That marriage is real, recognized, complete in the eyes of religion and law. But it is not the onda. The grand marriage is something else entirely, a separate, much larger rite of passage that a man undertakes. Often years into an existing marriage, once he and his family have saved enough to do it properly. It can stretch across many days of ceremony, feasting, music, and procession, drawing in not just two families but entire neighborhoods, with tailors sewing elaborate bubus and saluvas, jewelers preparing ornate pieces, caterers organizing meals for hundreds of guests, family members living abroad, and there is a substantial Comorian diaspora, particularly in France, will often fly home specifically for wedding season, which traditionally falls between July and September, timing their entire year around it. The onda is not really about the couple, or not only about them, it is about status. In much of Comorian society, and especially on Grande Comore, a man is not considered fully accomplished, is not granted a voice in community decisions, and traditionally cannot sit in the front rows of the mosque until he has completed his grand marriage. It marks the crossing into full adult standing in the community authority, respect, a formal place at the table of village decision-making. Families sometimes spend years, occasionally the better part of a lifetime's savings, preparing for it, because the alternative is a kind of permanent social minority status regardless of a man's actual age or achievements elsewhere. It's worth sitting with that for a moment, because it captures something true about this culture that no single fact about GDP or geography ever could. On these islands, belonging is earned publicly, ritually, and communally. It isn't assumed. It isn't private. It's demonstrated in front of everyone who matters to you at real cost. And that cost is exactly where the conversation about the onda gets complicated, because the same institution that anchors identity and reinforces family bonds has also drawn real criticism, including from Comorians themselves, for concentrating prestige in the hands of those wealthy enough to afford it, and for pressuring families of modest means into spending far beyond what they can reasonably manage in one of the world's poorer nations. It is, in other words, exactly the kind of institution real cultures actually have beautiful, binding, and genuinely double-edged, all at once. This is also where the Comorian story stretches well beyond the shores of the islands themselves, because a huge number of the people paying for these celebrations aren't actually living here anymore. Somewhere in the range of 150 to 200,000 people of Comorian citizenship or descent live abroad, the overwhelming majority of them in France, in communities built up around cities like Marseille and Paris over the past several decades. That diaspora is so large relative to the home population and so economically important that people here sometimes call it the fifth island of Comoros that exists not on any map, but in apartment blocks thousands of kilometers away, still funding weddings, still financing house building back home, still sending money for a cousin's school fees or a parent's medical bill. Whole grand marriages are routinely paid for, in part or in full, by relatives working construction jobs or driving taxis in French cities they now call home, flying back for a few weeks each summer to stand in the crowd their own money helped assemble. If you're finding this kind of deep dive into how people actually live somewhere interesting, this is a good moment to hit subscribe. There's a lot more of the world left to walk through together. Now let's talk honestly about the harder side of building a life here. Comoros is, by almost every conventional economic measure, one of the poorest nations on Earth. And it's worth understanding why, without either exaggerating it or looking away from it. Gross domestic product per person sits at roughly 1.5 to 1 and $700 a year in nominal terms, placing it among the smaller, less developed economies globally, even as growth has picked up modestly in recent years, generally in the range of 3 to 4% annually. A substantial share of the population, independent estimates have placed it as high as a third or more of Comorians lives below the poverty line, and unemployment and underemployment remain persistent structural problems, particularly for young people entering a labor market with relatively few formal jobs to offer. The economy leans heavily on agriculture and fishing for subsistence, supplemented by exports of the very spices that make the island's famous vanilla, clove, and ylang-ylang essential oil commodities, whose prices can swing sharply on global markets, taking entire rural incomes with them. Daily costs reflect that reality in very concrete ways. Because Comoros imports a large share of its food, fuel, and consumer goods, rice in particular, arrives largely from abroad. Despite being the national staple, prices for everyday necessities can be surprisingly high relative to local wages, especially in Moroni. Inflation has been a genuine strain in recent years, driven in part by global food and fuel prices, and cost of living pressure has, at points, spilled into public unrest, including protests in 2026, after fuel prices rose sharply. Unrest serious enough that the government moved to suspend the increases and reopen talks. Infrastructure adds its own layer of difficulty. Electricity supply across the islands has historically been unreliable, with periodic outages affecting homes, hospitals, and small businesses alike, and inter-island transport remains limited and comparatively expensive for a population that often needs to move between islands for work, school, or medical care. Healthcare and higher education infrastructure, while present and improving, particularly in Moroni, remain limited in scope compared to larger regional economies, and Comoros continues to rank low on international human development indicators. That fifth island we talked about earlier isn't just a sentimental idea, it's a load-bearing part of the actual economy. Money sent home by Comorians living abroad, overwhelmingly from France, has represented somewhere close to a fifth of the entire country's GDP in recent years, at times reportedly even more, which makes remittances a genuinely larger share of national income than the country's own exports of goods and services. That's an extraordinary level of dependence on relatives working abroad, and it cuts both ways. It has kept countless households afloat, funded home construction across the islands, and financed the very wedding traditions that define social status here. But it has also meant that a meaningful slice of the local economy runs on decisions made in Paris and Marseille rather than in Moroni, and that a slow generational shift as the diaspora's French-born grandchildren grow up with looser ties to the islands their grandparents left poses a real, open question about how sustainable that flow of support will remain. The government and international development partners have both flagged this as an area to watch, and have begun exploring ways to channel diaspora money toward productive investment rather than only ceremony and consumption. The physical backbone the country would need to reduce that dependence is still very much under construction, in the most literal sense. The national road network runs to only a few hundred kilometers across all three islands combined, a significant portion of it in need of real repair, and international development partners, including France's development agency, have stepped in with financing aimed specifically at improving inter-island transport, water access, and electricity, and acknowledgement built into the funding itself of just how much catching up remains to be done. And then there is the political history, the part that gave this video its title. Since gaining independence from France in 1975, Comoros has endured more than 20 coups or attempted coups, a run of instability virtually unmatched by any nation of its size anywhere in the world. The very first months of independence set the tone. President Ahmed Abdallah was overthrown barely a month after declaring independence, in a coup involving the French mercenary Bob Denard, who would go on to shape Comorian politics from the shadows for the better part of 2 decades, installing and removing leaders more or less at will. Entire presidencies here have ended not through elections but through armed takeovers, and in 1997, the islands of Anjouan and Moli even declared their own independence from the central government, triggering a secessionist crisis that took years and eventually an African Union military intervention to resolve. A new constitution, adopted in 2001, was specifically designed to end this cycle by rotating the presidency between the 3 islands and granting each one meaningful autonomy, and it has, by and large, worked, ushering in a period of relative, if imperfect, stability. The current president, Azali Assoumani, who first came to power through a coup of his own back in 1999, before later winning that role through legitimate elections and being re-elected multiple times since, most recently in 2024, has now presided over some of the calmest years in the country's post-independence history. Even as tensions over succession, governance, and living costs continue to surface, none of this makes daily life here dangerous in the way a tourist might imagine from the headline 20 coups. For most Comorians, most of the time, life proceeds in the ordinary rhythm of school runs and market mornings and mosque on Friday, not in the shadow of tanks. But the instability is not ancient history either, and it has left real, lasting scars on infrastructure that never received sustained investment, on institutions that had to be rebuilt again and again, and on a generation of young people who grew up watching their country's leadership change hands through force more often than through ballots. There is also a harder, more sobering thread tied to Mayotte, the 4th island that remains under French administration and enjoys a French standard of living, health care, and minimum wage that the rest of the archipelago simply does not. That gap has pushed thousands of Comorians over the decades to attempt the crossing to Mayotte by small, overloaded boats known as kwassa-kwassa, a journey that has cost an enormous number of lives in waters that have, grimly, come to be known among some observers as one of the most dangerous stretches of migrant water in the world. It's a difficult fact, but an honest telling of this country has to include it, because it says something real about the pull of opportunity just across a narrow, deadly channel. So, could you actually live here? It depends enormously on what you're looking for. And it's worth being honest with yourself about which version of living somewhere you actually want, rather than the postcard version that's easy to picture from a distance. If what you want is untouched volcanic landscape, water clear enough to watch turtles from the shore, a culture with genuine, unbroken traditions rather than performances staged for tourists, and a pace of life set by tide and season rather than notification, Comoros offers something vanishingly rare in this hyper-connected world. If what you need is dependable infrastructure, predictable institutions, and a wide margin for economic error, the honest answer is that daily life here would ask a great deal of you, in ways that go well beyond adjusting to a new climate or a new cuisine. But here's what stays with you after learning about a place like this. Despite the coups, despite the poverty, despite the very real difficulty of building a stable life on ground that occasionally reminds you it's still an active volcano, the culture here didn't just survive. It organized itself around continuity anyway. Families still save for years to hold the onda properly. Grandparents still pass down shikamori proverbs in the same courtyards their grandparents used. Fishermen still take the same boats out past the same reefs their fathers did, timing their work to the same two seasons that have governed these islands for as long as anyone can remember. There is a kind of resilience in that continuity that no coup and no crisis has managed to fully interrupt. That same warm, spiced air you'd smell slowly approaching these small islands by boat vanilla, clove, salt water, and something floral underneath it all carries, if you let it, both halves of the story we've just walked through. The beauty that gave this place its nickname, and the hard-won endurance of people who have kept choosing to call these four small volcanic islands home, generation after generation, coup after coup, wedding season after wedding season. Whether or not you could ever actually live here yourself, it's genuinely hard to walk away from a place like Comoros without a quiet respect for what it takes simply to keep going, and to keep celebrating on ground this restless. If this kind of honest, close look at how people actually live somewhere far from home is something you want more of, subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep making them, and I'd love to know in the comments whether Comoros is a place you'd ever consider seeing for yourself. Thank you sincerely for spending this quiet time on these islands with me. I'll see you in the next one.